Bien, ¿puedo hacer una pregunta rápida?
Claro. Sí, yo también lo he visto. Ahorita voy a ir a entender con ay, todo, que no tenemos instrucciones, que no tenemos los textos, que nos hacemos
Hola. Hola. Sí.
No puede ir tampoco derrotar.
Morning, brother.
How are you doing?
Good, good. Everything's fine. How are you?
Good. I don't know the morning is good or not today.
Yeah. Nobody's certain about it.
Maybe it's Russian or not.
Yeah, I don't know how it's
Making even worse our life. It was not easy, but now it's
it's become worse. I just. Hello. Can I come here?
Hello, how are you?
fine. Yourself?
Fine, thank you. Yourself?
Thank you. Though I'm not sure this morning is good or not.
I feel like we're wasting our time. Huh? They won't accept it.
It was not easy.
I think the dialogue here in this week shouldn't last more than 2 hours. We're not going to solve it. We understand. So we want to throw in Europeans, Russian, a couple of more. We can agree with two of them. The other one will probably vote. And our reason probably will vote. I hope they have recently we can agree with two amendments. We can agree with two.
Ja, das machen wir auf
Maybe the language we can we can agree. You're closer than us, so for us, for you it's more difficult.
Vous êtes obligé. Pas Nicolas, absolument pas. L'amour. T'as le son là, justement? Test. Vous avez le son. Test. Ah, c'est bien.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, please get seated so that we can start. So, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. I hereby declare open the 9th meeting of the 45th session of the Human Rights Council. And as you know, and as decided on Monday, the 14th of September, we will now hold the urgent debate on the situation of human rights in Belarus. You will recall that on the 11th of September, I received a letter from Germany on behalf of the states members of the European Union that are equally members of the Human Rights Council, containing the formal request to hold this urgent debate. The draft resolution entitled Situation of Human Rights in Belarus in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election and its aftermath was circulated to all delegations. I would like to remind you that the list of speakers opened on Tuesday at 2 p.m. and will close in 15 minutes from now. Let me recall once again that this urgent debate will follow the same modalities as a general debate of the Human Rights Council, and for the speaking time will be 2.5 minutes for members and 1.5 minutes for all observers. I appeal to everyone to respect this time limit. And without further ado, I will now give the floor to the Deputy High Commissioner to deliver her statement.
President, Your Excellencies, the Council's consideration of the recent events in Belarus is timely. Despite violent crackdowns by the Belarusian security forces and thousands of arrests, peaceful mass demonstrations have continued to contest the declared result of last month's presidential elections. They also call for an end to police violence and the resolution of broader human rights issues. Successive special rapporteurs on the situation of human rights in Belarus have consistently described a deeply oppressive environment for human rights in the country. I commend their work, recalling that it was in reaction to the crisis which followed the presidential election of December 2010 that the Council first established this mandate. As OHCHR reported, the December 2010 election was followed by a massive crackdown on political opponents, human rights groups and media. Hundreds of arrests took place, with allegations of torture and ill treatment in custody and violations of due process. Noting the lack of an independent judiciary and other vital human rights safeguards, the report made 15 recommendations to the government. Few were implemented, and almost 10 years after the December 2010 election, we see many of the same patterns recurring. Some are even intensifying. We witnessed thousands of arrests, hundreds of reports of torture and other ill treatment, including sexual violence and the reported torture of children. The violent abduction of people in broad daylight by masked individuals, presumably on the basis of their peacefully expressed opinions. Armed police and security personnel are being deployed in a near systematic pattern of unnecessary or excessive use of force against largely peaceful demonstrators. Authorities are aggressively pursuing criminal and administrative cases against people perceived as supporting the opposition. They include members of the Opposition Coordination Council, all but one of its leaders now in detention or abroad, as well as workers' leaders and other protesters. Those targeted may be placed in administrative detention for up to 25 days or charged with organizing or participating in mass disorder or other crimes which carry heavy prison sentences. Journalists reporting on the protests have been arbitrarily arrested and detained, ill-treated, stripped of their accreditation or equipment, and subjected to judicial harassment. Since the elections, the authorities have also repeatedly restricted internet access. In other words, we are seeing the same underlying systemic deficiencies leading to an intensifying cycle of serious human rights violations. I am particularly alarmed by the hundreds of allegations of torture and other ill treatment in police custody, with scant evidence of prompt investigation or official disapproval of these reported incidents. Instead, we have received worrying indications that victims and their lawyers are increasingly reluctant to present complaints of torture and other ill treatment for fear of retaliation. Your Excellency, it is vital for the future of Belarus to break these cycles of increasing repression and violence. This office is convinced that the most important key to good governance is to listen. It is not only the key, as you also need to act, but attentively listening to and hearing the varied voices of people in the context of genuine dialogue is the only way to ensure that government serves their needs, which is, after all, a government's duty. Instability and conflict are destructive and expensive. Repression, which drives grievances underground to fester, fuels both. When governments limit public freedoms and crack down on independent voices, they deny themselves the benefits of public engagement and undermine security and development. Civil society is a valuable partner, not a threat, and the free expression of a plurality of opinions should be welcomed, not repressed. I urge the authorities to fulfill their obligations under international human rights treaties. I encourage them also to engage in transparent, inclusive dialogue in place of violence, and to guarantee that there will be no reprisals whatsoever against those who contribute their ideas and demands. Violations of the fundamental rights to freedom of expression, information, and peaceful assembly should cease, and all those detained for voicing their dissent or for their participation in protests, strikes, and other peaceful actions should be immediately released. Harassment, intimidation, pressure, and reported expulsion from Belarus of members of the opposition, including the members of the Coordination Council, should stop. Human rights measures are the most effective basis for achieving sustainable development and stable, prosperous societies. There is a manifest need for reform, notably to advance the rule of law, build accountable institutions, and support good governance, following an inclusive consultative process that gives people a role in shaping the future that they want. I also urge the authorities to facilitate independent, transparent, prompt, effective, thorough, and impartial investigations into the allegations of serious violations, with a view to ensuring accountability and access to an effective remedy for victims. I urge the Council to facilitate genuine dialogue to further sustainable, peaceful, and inclusive solutions for all the people of Belarus, and to prevent these cycles of violence from further escalating. The fundamental rights of all Belarusians should prevail over political interests and geopolitical calculations. My office and the human rights mechanisms are ready to assist in assessing the human rights consequences of the current crisis and to provide recommendations and further technical assistance to address them. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy High Commissioner, and I can see that the Belarusian delegation have asked for the floor.
Доброе утро, уважаемые дамы и господа, уважаемые коллеги, уважаемая госпожа председатель. Мы хотели бы выступить по порядку ведения и поинтересоваться у вас, на каком основании представителю УВКПЧ структура, обслуживающая деятельность Совета ООН по правам человека, межгосударственного органа, предоставлено время для выступления перед открытием межправительственной дискуссии. Предоставлены 7 драгоценных минут из практически отсутствующего времени, с учетом того, что национальным делегациям предоставляется 2,5–1,5 минуты для выступления. В нашем понимании это прямое нарушение правил процедуры. мы просим разъяснить в письменном порядке в адрес белорусской миссии здесь действия в этом вопросе. Спасибо.
Thank you, Ambassador. I understand it's a long-standing procedure that in this opening bit of an urgent debate, time is first of all given to the High Commissioner or her deputy, and then to a limited number of speakers nominated by the initiators of such debates. That's exactly what we did in the summer when we had the urgent debate on, requested by the African Union on George Floyd, police, racism, etc. Thank you very much. We will now move on to the next speaker, and I give the floor via video to Mrs. Anaïs Marin, who will speak in her capacity as the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus and on behalf of the Coordinating Committee of Special Procedures. And I hope the video will start right now.
Thank you. Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to this urgent debate. The session is timely and pertinent given the catastrophic human rights situation in Belarus that continues to deteriorate. These unprecedented post-electoral developments require the renewed attention of the international community and the scrutiny of UN bodies and mechanisms. On 4th of September, I had a chance to address the UN Security Council members during an informal Area Formula meeting. I would like to reiterate some of the most serious challenges that I highlighted then. Although the human rights situation in Belarus has been marred by multiple systemic deficiencies for decades, the current crisis reveals the magnitude of the problem. During the whole electoral process, the authorities have denied Belarusian citizens their legitimate right to participate in public life. As I stated in my 2019 report to the UN General Assembly, since the last electoral cycle, nothing has changed in law and in practice that could have raised hope that this year's vote would meet the internationally recognized standards for free, fair, and transparent elections. The available reports indicate that the process was grossly manipulated. The electoral field had previously been cleared up to prevent 3 of the most popular candidates from running. This was followed by fraud at the vote count stage, which put under question the electoral legitimacy of the incumbent president. In fact, Mr. Lukashenko's eagerness to remain in power after the end of his current term appears to be the main cause of the current political deadlock in Belarus. Moreover, the president and his supporters stubbornly refuse to engage in dialogue with the opposition and civil society, which would be the only way to reconcile Belarusian society with its government after people from all social strata realized how serious and systematic state violations of the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of speech have been since election night. The whole world has seen how the repressive capacities of the law enforcement and judicial systems are used in Belarus to harass, threaten, punish, or otherwise silence any dissenting voice. Deaf to domestic and foreign calls to engage in an honest dialogue with the opposition, the authorities cynically brought charges against members of the Presidium of the Coordination Council. One of them, after bravely resisting attempts at forceful deportation, which in itself was a shocking precedent, is accused of, I quote, calls to action aimed at causing harm to national security committed through using the media and the internet. These charges imply that Mrs. Kolesnikova is now facing potential imprisonment for up to 5 years. Madam Vice President, let me stress that by all available accounts, the popular movement sparked by the alleged victory of Mr. Lukashenko is genuine, spontaneous, and peaceful. Belarusians massively took to the streets throughout the country to express their rejection of official results, which did not seem credible to them. As in the previous contested election in December 2010, they were violently prevented from exercising their right to peaceful assembly. The response of law enforcement agencies was again violent and disproportionate. To date, more than 10,000 people have been abusively arrested for taking part in peaceful protests, adding to some 1,500 already arrested since the crackdown started back in April. Most of them are now free, and I call on the authorities to immediately release and drop all politically motivated charges against those who remain arbitrarily detained. As demonstrations have spread to all sectors of society, from housewives to factory workers and students, I call on the police to immediately stop escalating violence. The right to demonstrate peacefully is a pillar of democratic society, and it can be exercised online too. By cutting off internet access starting on 9th of August, the government attempts to prevent voters from informing and coordinating with each other via social networks. Recurrent internet blockades are disproportionate and incompatible with the right to freedom of expression and access to information. So is the harassment of journalists, who are now accused in Belarus of participating or even coordinating the protest. Unable to find the leaders of this new type of revolt, police indiscriminately arrested demonstrators, journalists, passers-by, women, and even children. Some people were shockingly captured in the street by masked men in plain clothes. Thousands were savagely beaten. This brings me to yet another crucially important point. During this wave of brutal repression, over 500 cases of torture committed by state agents have been reported.
Sorry, I see there is a point of order by the Russian delegation, so we'll interrupt briefly and give the floor to Russia. You have the floor.
Госпожа председатель, спасибо большое за то, что предоставили возможность выступить. Я хотел бы обратить внимание вас и всех присутствующих на то, что формат срочных дебатов, которые сегодня и проходят, не предусматривает участие ни представителей УВКПЧ, в данном случае уважаемый заместитель Верховного комиссара ООН по правам человека, ни спецдокладчика, ни кого бы то ни было, кроме государств. Спасибо большое.
We have exactly the same format as we had at the urgent debate in the summer, at the request of the African Union, and the same format as in previous urgent debates. And I repeat it, we always start with the High Commissioner or his or her deputy, and then we have a limited number of speakers nominated by the initiator of the urgent debate, and that's exactly what we're having today. You have the floor again.
Спасибо большое. Вместе с тем, еще раз повторюсь, это не интерактивный диалог. Это срочные дебаты с участием представителей государств. Повторяюсь еще раз, не интерактивный диалог. Он не предусматривает диалога с представителями УВКПЧ, с мандатариями или с кем бы то ни было еще. Спасибо.
Yeah, thank you very much. So as I said, we had the same situation in the summer where the speakers nominated by the African Union, who had requested that urgent debate, had nominated a number of personalities who were not representatives of states. And that's exactly what we're having at the moment. So thank you very much. And I would now ask the Secretariat to show us the rest of the video. Belarus also wants to speak. Please do. I see. Belarus was pointing to Venezuela, so Venezuela has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving me the floor. And we are taking the floor to support the point of order expressed by Belarus, for Belarus and Russia, for the terms expressed and the reasoning expressed by these countries, by these delegations. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. As I said before, the tradition for urgent debates, and this is the 6th urgent debate we are having in the history of the Human Rights Council, is that such debates are being started by the High Commissioner, followed by a limited number of speakers, nominated by the initiator of the urgent debate, and this is exactly what we did in previous cases. So this is what we are doing today, with your understanding. Belarus still wants to come in?
Благодарю вас, уважаемая госпожа председатель. Извиняюсь, что беру свое слово в очередной раз. Беларусь будет настаивать на основании нарушений правил процедуры на исключении записи выступления и представителей ВКПЧ, и госпожи Анаис Морен из рекордс нашей сегодняшних сессии. Спасибо.
Ambassador, there are no such rules of procedures. As I explained before, we are following exactly the procedure we have always had in the case of urgent debates, and this is the 6th in a line, where we start with the High Commissioner and then a limited numbers of speakers who are not necessarily on behalf of states. We've done that before, and that's what we're doing today. So I can see China.
主席女士，中方代表团支持白俄罗斯代表团提议。我们也认为，紧急辩论只能允许国家代表发言，它不是互动对话，所以我们认为，高专以及副高专都不能参加。谢谢。
I can see Russia again.
Госпожа председатель, спасибо, что еще раз предоставили мне слово. Хотели бы поддержать наших коллег из Белоруссии и из Китая в отношении просьбы об исключении видеозаписей выступления заместителя Верховного комиссара ООН по правам человека, а также спецдокладчика. Также просили бы прекратить диалог со спецдокладчиком, который не предусмотрен проведением срочных дебатов. И, как нам представляется, ссылка на процедуры здесь не совсем уместна, поскольку в данных срочных дебатах именно процедура проведения таких срочных дебатов как раз и нарушается. Спасибо.
Well, thank you very much for all these statements. Let me just repeat that we are doing exactly what was done in the case of previous urgent debates. There are no rules of procedure, precise ones on how to proceed. So we have been doing exactly what we did in these precedent cases, which I think is a good tradition and which wasn't contested by anybody. For example, in the case of the African Union, where equally we had a number of speakers who had been nominated by the sponsors, by the initiators, without anybody contesting that. So having said that, I think we should stick to that procedure because we shouldn't create any new procedures right now. Okay, so I would now like to ask the Secretariat that we pursue the video. Thank you very much. Well, you know, at this stage of the procedure, normally observers cannot change anything about the procedure. I've given you the floor various times now out of courtesy. Do you wish to say anything new? I give the floor one last time to Belarus now.
Спасибо, уважаемая госпожа председатель. Прецедент – источник права в англосаксонской системе. В этом зале находятся представители государств, которые используют разные правовые системы. И в этой связи не рассматриваем предыдущие прецеденты как основания для действий в текущей конкретной ситуации. У нас есть правила процедуры и просим их придерживаться.
No rules of procedure. Russia? Last time, then I'm going to say something.
Спасибо за то, что предоставили в очередной раз мне слово. Мы хотели бы еще раз повторить наше обращение к вам, как председателю, к секретариату, обращение с просьбой прекратить нарушение правил и процедуры и придерживаться формата проведения срочных дебатов. В данном случае мы еще раз повторяем просьбу нас и представителей других государств прекратить трансляцию диалога со спецдокладчиком, который не предусмотрен форматом проведения срочных дебатов по государству. Мы, как представители государств, просили бы прислушаться к нам. Спасибо.
Well, thank you very much, dear colleagues. I've checked again with the Secretariat. There are no rules of procedure on how exactly to handle in detail urgent debate. So the best thing to start from are, of course, the precedents which we have had, the 5 precedents which I've mentioned before. So this is what we are doing. This is how we composed the agenda for today. I will not give the floor to any further observers who want to come in at this stage. I would now like to ask the Secretariat to show us the rest of the video with the Special Rapporteur. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As I was saying, during this wave of brutal repression, over 500 cases of torture committed by state agents have been reported to us. During the week of 10th of August, hundreds of detainees were subject to humiliating conditions and degrading treatment. I have been informed of allegations of rape, electrocution, and other forms of physical and psychological torture. What is more, the perpetrators seem confident that they will not be prosecuted because of prevailing lawlessness and impunity. Yet it is the responsibility of the Belarusian state to prevent, investigate, and punish these crimes, which are all the more serious because they were committed in a premeditated and organized manner. I call on the authorities to shed full light on these tragic events and to guarantee the right of victims of torture to obtain redress. Given the abuse they suffered, these victims are in such a state of post-traumatic shock that they still require urgent humanitarian aid. Excellencies, let's not allow another Iron Curtain to descend on the European continent. Border closures will not stop international scrutiny. In view of the seriousness of the reported abuses, let me recall that human rights violations are not an internal affair. They are of interest to the international community. I therefore reiterate my call on the Belarusian leadership to reason and to exercise restraint. The only possible way out of this crisis is dialogue, which must be open, honest, and inclusive, involving all stakeholders, including, in particular, the opposition and civil society leaders. To conclude, Belarusian society has changed considerably over the past years, and in recent months, it developed a capacity for civil resilience and invented ways to demand respect for human rights. Belarusians showed how eager they are to see and take part in democratic changes. We should all continue working together to ensure that their legitimate will is respected and materializes in the near future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And we will now listen to the next video, which is by Mrs. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The situation in Belarus demands immediate international attention. Peaceful protesters are being illegally detained, beaten, and raped. Some of the protesters have been found dead. Even with the long list of human rights...
Okay, so let us interrupt just 1 minute. Belarus wishes to speak.
Уважаемая госпожа председатель, я вновь прошу прекратить трансляцию видео, не имеющих отношения ни по сути, ни по процедурной стороне к событию, которое происходит сегодня здесь, в стенах Совета ООН по правам человека. Выступление отдельно избранных граждан Республики Беларусь не может рассматриваться приемлемым. Просьба прекратить трансляцию видео Светланы Тихановской.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. As I said before, we are following the precedent of previous urgent debates where we're listening to different voices. You'll be given the floor right after this. So I would now ask the Secretariat that we pursue this debate so that we can make some progress with our agenda. Thank you very much.
Uses for the regime of Lukashenko, the events that are taking place in Belarus since the stolen election of August 9.
Just 1 minute. I asked before observers not to come at this stage. I am asking the Secretariat to show us the end of these videos, and then we'll have the procedure that you know, that the concerned country will be given the floor and so on. As I said, I will not take any further remarks from observers, but I give the floor to Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm sorry for taking the floor again, but I need to present this point of order as well and echo the claims of the concerned country of Belarus. And I make a call to the presidency to please stop violating the reglement and stop the projection of these videos, who has never happened in previous debate or urgent debates here at the Council. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll give the floor to the Ambassador of Germany.
Thank you, Madam President. I think you've been very patient, and we've all been very patient, but I think now is the time to pursue, and I can only repeat what you said. We don't have rules of procedure for urgent debates, and you are following exactly the pattern that we've seen very recently. So I urge all member states and also all those who are not members of the Human Rights Council to observe this practice and have a free and fair exchange of views on this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Just to give you some support as well, as my German colleague has done, we do not support the points of order made by the delegations of Russia, Belarus, Venezuela and China. We follow standard practice and procedure of the Council, and we ask you to continue the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. We would like to support the statement just made by Germany and the Netherlands. We fully support their statement. We do not support the point made by the delegations of Russia, Belarus and Venezuela, and we believe we follow standard practice and procedures of the Council, and we ask all of us, to continue the debate. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I think we should not spend more time about this now. I will not give the floor to any further observers. I would like to make a ruling now, which is, as I said before, that we are following the precedents of previous debates of that kind, like we did in the summer. We will therefore allow those to speak who have been nominated by the initiators, followed by the country concerned. If anybody doesn't agree with this, we would have to take a vote. But I would, at this stage, ask the Secretariat to show us the rest of the video.
Are unprecedented. The scope and the brutality of the extensive force used by the regime is in clear violation of all international norms and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations and Belarus as its founding member. The adoption of the declaration means that the Belarus has taken an obligation toward the international community to observe and respect human dignity and basic human rights, such as freedom of opinion and assembly. This also means that the international community has a right to react in strongest terms when this obligation is not being met. We, the democratic majority of Belarusians, have repeatedly expressed our commitment to the rule of law, to democratic values and to peaceful dialogue. I once again emphasize our willingness to talk with the authorities and look for peaceful solution to the crisis that has affected our nation. Our demands are simple and completely in line with all basic international norms. We demand to immediately cease violence against peaceful citizens. We demand immediate release of all political prisoners. We demand to allow entry and free movements to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. Finally, we demand free and fair elections so the citizens of Belarus can freely choose their government according to the laws of the country. 17 countries of Organization for Security and Cooperation invoked a so-called Moscow mechanism to look into human rights violations. It proves that everything is possible if there is a will. Belarus needs fast and resolute decisions. It's very important to recognize that standing up for democratic principles and human rights is not interfering in internal affairs. It is a universal question of human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would now ask the Secretary to show us the next video, which is by Mrs. Ekaterina Novikava.
Меня зовут Екатерина Новикова, я являюсь гражданской активисткой. 10 августа 2020 года я вышла из своего дома, чтобы посетить гипермаркет. По пути в гипермаркет я встретила кордон и большое количество военной техники, военных с оружием, в бронежилетах. Я спросила, как мне пройти в магазин. Они сказали, что нельзя идти по проспекту, вы можете пройти через Немигу. Я последовала их совету, пошла через Немигу. В результате встретила кордон из людей в черной форме, просила их пройти, они отказались, сказали, что не положено, отказались посмотреть мою сумку, я попросила, чтобы они позвали старшего. Пришел мужчина, который сказал, что гипермаркета здесь нет. Я ответила, что точно знаю, что он есть, потому что живу здесь. После чего мужчина схватил меня за шею, в таком положении затащил в автобус, где, тормоша меня за волосы, бил по голове со словами: «Курва, я сейчас твою плешивую голову отобью». Я осталась сидеть в этом автобусе, у меня отобрали телефон, сказали разблокировать, иначе будут применить насилие. После задержали еще несколько случайных прохожих, они задержали их таким образом, что выбежали люди с оружием, люди испугались, побежали в нашу сторону, а там с криками: «Идите сюда, шлюхи, присоединяйтесь к нам, как в Крым». Их задержали люди в черном. Это были мать и дочь, две женщины около 20 лет и мужчина-велосипедист. Мужчину избили, положили лицом в пол, одели ему наручники. Женщину всех забрали, всех, в принципе, забрали телефоны, сказали разблокировать, изучали содержимое, сказали, что у вас белая лента, это запрещенная символика, вы все будете привлечены к уголовной ответственности. Я попросила составить протокол задержания, мне отказали, сказали, что дайте по голове. Женщины, включая меня, просились в туалет. Нам сказали, что перетерпите, мы терпели около 5 часов. Нас не пустили. Мужчина просил, спустя часа 3 просил ослабить ему браслеты. Ему сказали, что в таком случае ты увидишь по уголовной статье нападение сотрудника милиции. Около полуночи за нами приехал автозак. Нас поместили с одной женщиной в автозак. В соседний отсек поместили мужчин, очень много их били, они кричали от боли. Нам сказали, что мы едем в центральный РОВД, однако мы поехали в ЦИП. В ЦИПе, когда мы вышли из автозака, я увидела военную машину, мужчин с оружием, видела там весь двор в мужчинах, которые лежат со связанными руками, их бьют, избивают ногами, палками. Мужчины, которые стояли лицом, на коленях лицом к стене, и мужчины, которые приседали лицом к стене. Их всех тоже били, всем говорили, что вы за Тихановскую голосовали, вот вам ваша Тихановская, вот вам перемены, мы вас всех тут убьем, и ничего нам за это не будет. После нас подвели к крыльцу, я видела, что скорая откачивала мужчину, который был очень избит, он был перебинтован. Я попросила медицинскую помощь, один из сотрудников сказал, что я сейчас тебе эту дубинку в одно место засуну, ты ее родишь. После нас завели в коридор, где в шеренгу стояло около 20 мужчин голых. Они стояли на коленях, голова внизу. Их избивали и говорили, что Тихановская вас обманула, она уехала в Литву, а вот вам перемены ваши. Мне заломали руку. И после осмотра меня также привели в этот коридор и поставили стоять на коленях. Толкнули мне еще в спину дубинкой. После нас повели в камеру. В камере нас находилось от 23 до 53 человек, хотя камера рассчитана на 4. Нас не кормили, не поили, не оказывали медицинскую помощь. Одной женщине, у нее был диабет, ей не давали инсулин. После нас заставляли подписать протоколы, говорили, что будет суд, однако меня утром 12 числа вывели опять смотреть, как избивают мужчин, и выпустили без вещей и без ничего. После я обращалась в больницу, я обращалась в прокуратуру, я обращалась в Следственный комитет. Однако до настоящего момента никакого уголовного дела не возбуждено. 16 сентября со мной связывался следователь и говорил, что пока что нет никаких результатов экспертиз, уголовное дело не возбуждено, и я не знаю, будет ли оно возбуждено. Я хочу сказать, что в настоящее время власти Беларуси узаконили бандитизм. Они пытаются всех нас убедить, что мы все социальные личности, которые сами нанесли себе увечья. И я прошу мировую общественность как-то повлиять на эту ситуацию, потому что самостоятельно нас не слышат, нас не хотят видеть и как-то с нами разговаривать.
Okay, that was a bit abrupt an ending, but I understand the video is finished, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative and ambassador of Belarus. You have the floor as the concerned country. You have 5 minutes.
Уважаемая госпожа председатель, я хочу вновь заявить о несогласии с рассмотрением ситуации с правами человека в нашей стране в рамках специальных дебатов и с тем, как это происходит. Выступления инициаторов других лиц и сам текст резолюции, который представлен, созданы из неподтвержденных ссылок на якобы заслуживающее доверия сообщения голословных обвинений правительства в нарушении международных обязательств. Правительство отвергает любые внешние оценки, ставящие под сомнение результаты выборов, как атаку на право белорусского народа реализовать суверенный выбор. Настойчивое продвижение иностранными государствами на международных площадках альтернативных оценок рассматриваем как вмешательство во внутренние дела. Белорусский народ высказался, и его мнение подтверждено Центральной избирательной комиссией, Верховным и Конституционными судами. В отсутствие мандата и непризнанных критериев считаем допустимым использовать СПЧ ООН для рассмотрения вопроса о выборах в любой стране в любой постановке. Недопустимым. Распространение в СМИ неподтвержденной информации в утвердительной и обвинительной манере, как это произошло в отношении событий в Беларуси со стороны специальных процедур СПЧ и некоторых пресс-служб руководителей международных организаций, является грубым злоупотреблением их полномочиями. Заявляем о нашем несогласии с позицией о серьезном ухудшении состояния прав человека в Беларуси в связи с выборами 2020 года. Невозможно отреагировать на все обвинения в рамках регламента, поэтому и не ставим такой задачи, тем более, что суть обвинений сводится к набору предположений в формате highly likely. Такой подход не может служить основой для принятия документа ООН, предполагающего финансовые и иные практические последствия для ОВКПЧ и для Совета. СМИ и соцсети представили миру однобокую картину в поддержку сил, которые проиграли выборы в Беларуси. К сожалению, для всего белорусского общества несогласие меньшей части населения с итогами выборов привело к политическому противостоянию. Уличные акции протестов привели к насилию и жертвам как со стороны протестующих, так и органов правопорядка. События после голосования сделали особенно очевидным внешнее вмешательство в политические процессы страны, в частности при помощи использования телеграм-каналов, администрируемых из-за рубежа. Их администраторы призывали и продолжают призывать к уличным акциям, организовывать протесты и оперативно координировать их тактику. Через социальные сети распространяются угрозы насилием в адрес государственных служащих и их семей. Практически все протестные акции не соответствовали закону о порядке проведения массовых мероприятий. При этом речь не идет о запрете права на мирный протест, но о порядке его осуществления. Таким образом, участники также нарушали закон. Отсюда тысячи задержанных. Несмотря на обратное утверждение оппонентов власти, протестные акции в период с 9 по 12 августа не всегда носили мирный характер. Они нередко характеризовались использованием участниками подручных средств, камней, палок, баррикад, автомобилей или заранее подготовленных средств, бутылок с зажигательными смесями. Они также нередко характеризовались насильственным сопротивлением должностным лицам, законно требовавшим прекращения несанкционированных массовых мероприятий. В ходе протестов силы правопорядка были вынуждены неоднократно применять физическую силу. Это делалось в целях наведения общественного порядка, в интересах национальной безопасности, для пресечения противоправных, в том числе насильственных действий. Подчеркну в этой аудитории, что с учетом характера угроз, правоохранительные органы государств, инициировавших эту дискуссию, вряд ли бы поступили иначе. Подтверждений этому множество. Итогом применения физической силы со стороны сил правопорядка и насильственных действий участников протестов стали многочисленные травмы и тех, и других. К сожалению, не обошлось без жертв среди протестующих. В разных источниках от 1 до 5 погибших. И в этом ситуация в Беларуси не отличается от многих других стран. Меры по наведению порядка, задержание, доставка и содержание задержанных породили множество обвинений о применении чрезвычайного насилия. По имеющейся информации подано свыше 900 жалоб на насильственные действия представителей сил правопорядка. За медпомощью обратились свыше 130 сотрудников правоохранительных органов. Некоторые из них с тяжелыми увечьями до сих пор находятся в больнице. По всем жалобам ведется проверка. По решению Генпрокуратуры для координации создана специальная межведомственная комиссия. Проверки показывают, что многие сообщения не находят подтверждения. Лавина фейк-ньюс. Установлены случаи оговоров сотрудников сил правопорядка. Выявлены постановочные видео с сложными заявлениями. Юридические процедуры по проверке обвинений о незаконном применении силы в ходе протестов по установлению и наказанию виновных проводятся в строгом соответствии с законом. Подходя к концу выступления, мы опровергаем неподтвержденные обвинения в сексуальном насилии против задержанных. Зарегистрированных официальных заявлений об этом нет. Также не подтверждается информация о пропавших без вести в непосредственной связи с протестами. Утверждения о наличии в стране политических заключенных не соответствуют реальности. Есть люди, которые взяты под стражу в рамках конкретных уголовных дел в соответствии с Уголовно-процессуальным кодексом. В заключение констатирую, что несмотря на продолжение несанкционированных акций протеста в последние недели, ситуация находится под полным контролем правительства. За этот же период отсутствует утверждение о применении чрезмерной силы. Как неоднократно отмечалось президентом Республики Беларусь, выход из текущей ситуации будет осуществляться в рамках широкого национального диалога, требования о политических реформах, о возможности проведения досрочных выборов будут рассмотрены при работе над поправками в Конституцию. Для обеспечения юридической стороны вопроса уже работает экспертная группа во главе с заместителем председателя Конституционного суда. Беларусь располагает всем необходимым для самостоятельного и мирного разрешения текущих политических противоречий в обществе. Правительство оставляет за собой право на определение реакции на принятое Советом решение по итогам этих дебатов, в том числе в части взаимодействия с Советом, с УВКПЧ и в части проведения двусторонних диалогов по правам человека. Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we'll now start with our speakers list. Incidentally, the speakers list is closed now. I start by giving the floor, as we did last time, to the distinguished representative of the initiator of that debate, and that is Germany on behalf of the European Union. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Madam President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. The candidate countries, the Republic of North Macedonia, Montenegro and Albania, the country of the stabilization and association process and potential candidate Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Ukraine, align themselves with this statement. The EU thanks the Deputy High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur for the valuable information. We also thank Mrs. Tikhanovskaya and Mrs. Novikova for their important testimonies. The EU is deeply concerned about the serious deterioration of the human rights situation in Belarus in the run-up to and the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election. This election was neither fair nor free. It was followed by violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of peaceful assembly and association, the freedom of opinion and expression, and the freedom of information. We are alarmed at the special procedure mandate holders' report of attacks on and torture and cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment of peaceful protesters, as well as intimidation and detention of opposition leaders. Enforced disappearances, abductions, expulsions and arbitrary detentions continue in Belarus. We call for the immediate release of all those who have been arbitrarily deprived of their liberty. We are also concerned about credible allegations of widespread torture and cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment by law enforcement officers, including in detention centres, which urgently require an independent investigation. For these reasons, the EU has tabled a resolution requesting the High Commissioner to make an interim oral update with recommendations to this Council before the end of the year and to present a comprehensive written report on the human rights situation in the lead-up to, during and after the 2020 presidential election in Belarus at the 46th session, followed by an interactive dialogue. We believe that the continued scrutiny of the Council is key to prevent further escalation on the ground. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I give the floor to Denmark on behalf of Nordic countries. And we're listening to a statement from His Excellency Mr. Jeppe Kofod, who is the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Denmark.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. The human rights situation in Belarus has been grim for decades. Intimidation and repression have systematically been used by the authorities. In recent months, the situation has deteriorated alarmingly. We therefore welcome this important and timely urgent debate. The people of Belarus are asking for their human rights to be respected and for their voices to be heard. The presidential election in August was neither free nor fair. The population was deprived of the opportunity to decide over the future of their country. The Nordic countries are deeply concerned about the failure of the Belarusian authorities to respect and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, not least freedom of peaceful assembly and association and freedom of opinion and expression, both online and offline. We are alarmed by credible allegations of widespread torture and cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. We call for full accountability for those responsible. And furthermore, we call on the Belarusian authorities to immediately release all those unlawfully detained. Finally, we welcome the start of an independent OSCE fact-finding mission under the Moscow mechanism as a very important step. Madam President, we cannot stand by silently as we witness such appalling human rights violation. The Nordic countries therefore strongly support the adoption of the presented resolution today. We stand in solidarity with the Belarusian people in their fight for their rights and their future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will now listen to another video, this time by His Excellency Mr. Ivan Korczok, who is the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Slovakia.
President, human rights are a driver for progress and prosperity of people, and they can live freely only in a state where the rule of law is respected. Indeed, democratic elections, free and fair, are fundamental in building nations' trust towards government and its legitimacy. The presidential elections in Belarus on August 9, 2020 were neither free nor fair. On the contrary, they were rigged. Moreover, the regime brutally cracked down on peaceful protesters. Today, we witness its disrespect for the rule of law and gross disregard of human rights. Several thousand people and protesters have been detained only because they wanted to exercise the right to freedom of expression. People are brutally beaten on the streets merely because of their different political stand. Reports of torturing and ill treatment of people in police custody are alarming. Freedom of media is strongly restricted, and the brutality of the regime is even increasing. This is truly unacceptable. It must be stopped immediately and prevented from happening any further. The international community cannot be silenced when the human rights are severely violated in Belarus, I welcome the reactions of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as UN human rights experts on the situation in Belarus. My country supports the opportunity for the Human Rights Council as the relevant actor to take the action on this pressing issue as well. Slovakia too strongly supports UN actions, including those of the Human Rights Council or other relevant bodies that would add to concerted efforts, including OSCE, towards free and fair elections and establishing democracy and the rule of law in Belarus. I call on Belarus authorities to launch an inclusive dialogue with the civil society with the common goal of addressing the very natural desire of ordinary people for better life. People of Belarus fully deserve it.
Thank you very much, Minister. We now watch a video statement by His Excellency Mr. Zbigniew Rau, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to express my gratitude to all distinguished speakers who briefed us on the distressing situation in Belarus during this timely convened urgent debate. At this forum, Poland has continuously expressed its concerns about systemic human rights violations in Belarus, as presented in subsequent reports of the Special Rapporteur. However, the unprecedented scale of repressions targeting political opponents and civil society during the presidential campaign and in the aftermath of the elections is alarming. We are appalled by regularly repeating incidents of mass detentions of peaceful protesters, enforced disappearances, and allegations of torture and ill treatment, including violence used against women or minors. This debate in the Human Rights Council is a clear sign that the international community does not give its consent to any human rights violations that have been reported in Belarus, since each and every country has to fulfill its obligations under international human rights law. Therefore, we strongly reiterate our calls on Belarusian authorities to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of peaceful assembly and association, to release all unlawfully detained, to bring to justice the individuals responsible for human rights violations, and to ensure that every man and every woman in Belarus enjoys fully their rights. Ladies and gentlemen, Poland, as a member of this Council, will continue to support the aspirations of the Belarusian society to fully enjoy fundamental freedoms, as well as the determination of the Belarusians to live in a free and democratic country, respectful of their human rights. We call on the authorities of Belarus to engage in an inclusive dialogue with society and to cooperate meaningfully with international human rights mechanisms, including the UN country-specific Special Rapporteur.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is His Excellency Mr. Stefanus Blok, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Madam President, I welcome the opportunity to participate in this debate. Week after week, hundreds of thousands of people have been taking to the streets all over Belarus. Despite police brutality, intimidation, and arbitrary arrest, peaceful protesters continue to raise their voices. Their message is clear. They want the Belarusian authorities to listen to their call. It is a call for free and fair elections, a call for human rights and fundamental freedoms to be respected, a call for accountability. I am deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Belarus, and I strongly condemn the violence against protesters, journalists, human rights defenders, and representatives of the Coordination Council. The Belarusian authorities need to demonstrate accountability. For this, independent investigations are essential. Today, we need to take action. The situation requires a strong, timely, and credible response from this Council. In line with the EU's intervention, the Netherlands strongly supports a resolution calling on the Belarusian authorities to end the violence immediately, to engage with the Coordination Council, and to facilitate independent investigations into all allegations of human rights violations in order to hold the perpetrators to account. We urge the Belarusian authorities to cooperate fully with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This includes providing full and unhindered access to the country. The brave defenders of democracy in Belarus deserve an equally brave international response. Today, we must raise our voices in support of those people who, simply by raising their own voices, are risking their very lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next video statement is by His Excellency Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Madam President, Ukraine is closely following developments in Belarus. It is heartbreaking to watch the footage of our close neighbors viciously beaten down and arbitrarily detained on the streets of their native cities. Upon the establishment of the UN Human Rights Council, we all have taken the commitment to protect and promote the ideal of a free person enjoying human rights, including political, and freedom from fear. The course chosen by the authorities of Belarus goes against this commitment. Moreover, unacceptable violence against peaceful protests in Belarus demonstrates that crackdown and repressions provoke more resistance and defiance. The Belarusian society pursues one and only goal, which is to defend their choice and right to free expression of the will, a genuine and natural aspiration. The foreign ministries of the Lublin Triangle countries, Ukraine, Lithuania and Poland, were among the first to express their concern over the violence, to call the official Minsk for restraint, dialogue and unconditional release of detained protesters, as well as to offer our good services. In response, we have heard groundless accusations of foreign instigation of protests, while people of Belarus continue to be oppressed and opposition leaders forced out of the country or arrested. The UN international human rights mechanisms can and should play a role in resolving this crisis. We call on the UN Commissioner on Human Rights and Special Procedures of the Council to closely monitor the situation on the ground and to continue providing timely and comprehensive assessment. We also encourage the official Minsk to engage constructively with the UN human rights mechanisms. Ukraine wishes to underline the absolute unacceptability of interfering in Belarus' internal affairs. The right to decide the democratic future of the country belongs exclusively to the people of Belarus. We warn the Russian Federation against taking steps that may lead to undermining political sovereignty of Belarus and thus destabilizing the wider region. Ukraine remains committed to good neighborly relations with the people of Belarus based on respect for democratic values, rule of law and human rights. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last dignitary on our list is His Excellency Mr. Georg Georgiev, Deputy Foreign Minister of Bulgaria. We equally listen to a video statement.
Madam President, Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. We join the call for an urgent debate on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We have been following the latest developments in the country very closely and with increasing concern. We are worried by the attacks against the freedom of opinion and expression, as well as media independence and pluralism in Belarus. The use of disproportionate and unacceptable violence against peaceful protesters, detention of opposition leaders and supporters, media workers are unacceptable. We call on the Belarusian government to release immediately and unconditionally all political prisoners and detained. We expect a thorough and transparent investigation into all alleged abuses in order to hold those responsible to account. We are concerned about the criminal case opened against the Coordination Council, as well as the intimidation, detention and attempts for forced exile of its members. We insist on the release of Maria Kolesnikova and a guarantee for safe return of those forcibly removed from their country. Bulgaria supports the rights of the friendly Belarusian people to determine their own democratic future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to the list of speakers, ambassadors present in the room, starting with the Ambassador of Canada on behalf of a group of countries.
I have the honor to read this statement on behalf of 35 states. We are deeply troubled by and condemn the recently reported and ongoing use of partial and complete internet shutdowns, as well as targeted content blocking by the government of Belarus in the aftermath of the fraudulent 2020 Belarusian presidential elections. Shutdowns and blocking or filtering of services unjustifiably limit the rights of peaceful assembly and freedoms of association and expression, especially when they lack procedural fairness and transparency. In conjunction with restrictive measures and intimidation employed against the opposition candidates and the mass arrests and detentions of Belarusian civil society members and journalists, actions to limit access to the internet, including social media and other digital communication platforms, further erode civic space. We will continue to stand with the people of Belarus who are making their voices heard in spite of these oppressive measures, and we are especially heartened by the critical and central role women are playing in calling for fairness and accountability. Civic space online is integral to a vibrant civic space offline. Government should not block or hinder internet connectivity, as shutdowns often undermine human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the rights of peaceful assembly and freedoms of association and expression that form the basis of a democratic society. Internet shutdowns impact all users, especially marginalized groups and those in vulnerable situations. Shutdowns limit media freedom and the ability of journalists and human rights defenders to report on human rights violations or abuses and hold governments accountable. Shutdowns and restrictions also limit the dissemination and free flow of information, harm economic activity, contribute to social and political disorder, and negatively affect public safety. Human rights must be protected online just as they are protected offline. We call on Belarusian authorities to refrain from internet shutdowns and blocking or filtering of services and to respect Belarus's international human rights obligations, including under Articles 19 and 21 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We call on the government of Belarus to respect civic space, including respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, democracy, and the rule of law. Independent, transparent, and impartial investigations into all allegations of human rights violations in the context of the election must be conducted and the perpetrators brought to justice. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Madam President. Australia is deeply concerned at the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus and thanks the High Commissioner for highlighting this issue in her oral update to the Council. Australia was disappointed by the conduct of the presidential elections on the 9th of August and the lack of transparency regarding the result. We are concerned at the arbitrary detention of protesters, journalists and opposition members, both before and after the election. Australia calls on Belarus to free imprisoned presidential candidates and members of the opposition and those detained during peaceful protests. We deplore reports of the use of violence against peaceful protesters exercising their democratic freedoms. Australia supports all people's rights to assemble and protest peacefully. We are very concerned by reports of beatings and torture in places of detention and call for independent investigations into these reports and the prosecution of those responsible. We call for an end to any further violence and for the human rights of the Belarusian people to be respected. We reiterate our previous disappointment that Belarus continues its policy of non-engagement with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We urge the government of Belarus to engage constructively with UN mandate holders and to respect the rights and legitimate democratic aspirations of its people. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I give the floor to Austria.
Madam President, Austria welcomes the convening of this urgent debate and fully aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU. We thank today's speakers for the comprehensive assessment of the situation in Belarus. Austria is deeply concerned about the developments in Belarus after the presidential elections. Free and fair elections are a fundamental component of any democratic society and form the basis for the legitimate government. We regret that the
y una inobjetable victoria al honorable presidente Alexander Lukashenko. Es lamentable que los países de la Unión Europea no hayan reconocido los resultados de las elecciones y hayan promovido la celebración de este debate urgente. Hemos denunciado que las protestas violentas en Bielorrusia fueron cuidadosamente preparadas y coordinadas para desconocer los resultados electorales que dieron la victoria al presidente Alexander Lukashenko con más del 80% de los votos. Deploramos el uso de este Consejo como medio de presión política sobre las autoridades bielorrusas. Existen actualmente graves situaciones de violación de los derechos humanos en el mundo que ameritan la atención de este Consejo. En los últimos días, nuestra región ha sido triste protagonista del uso desproporcionado de la fuerza por parte de agentes de seguridad en contra de manifestantes indefensos, que ha dejado un saldo lamentable de pérdidas de vidas, hechos estos dolorosos sobre los cuales se guarda silencio cómplice. Este debate urgente no está acorde con el tradicional accionar de este Consejo. Tiene como objetivo aumentar la presión sobre el legítimo gobierno de Bielorrusia, lo cual es inaceptable. El gobierno del presidente Nicolás Maduro condena con la mayor firmeza la injerencia extranjera y respalda las acciones del gobierno bielorruso para mantener la paz y defender la soberanía y la autodeterminación del país. Gracias, Presidenta.
Gracias. And I give the floor to Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies. The Republic of the Marshall Islands joins other nations in expressing serious concern regarding credible evidence of recent human rights violations in Belarus. We are concerned regarding the use of excessive and violent force against peaceful protests, and we call for peaceful protest and free speech to proceed in a manner consistent with universal human rights norms. We are also concerned regarding efforts to prevent the free flow of information, including the use of targeted internet blackouts, as well as reports of mass arrests, as well as political motivated arrests, abduction, and torture. These reports of rights violations should be openly and fairly addressed in an objective and independent manner. We accordingly support efforts for ongoing monitoring and reporting by the Office of the High Commissioner, as well as to ensure that Human Rights Council's specialized procedures have free, full, and unhindered access. The need for full accountability for human rights is not a political ploy, but rather part of the essential function and legal mandate of the UN Human Rights Council, which should be applied without exception. It is important to recall explicit prior warnings by the Council regarding preventative measures regarding human rights and the elections, including as specified in Resolution 44/19. It is apparent that this warning was disregarded. We are hopeful that going forward, better prevention is achieved to avoid further deterioration of the situation, as well as access to justice and full accountability. Como dada, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Doy la palabra a España.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. España suscribe la intervención de la Unión Europea y toma la palabra en primer lugar para felicitar a este Consejo por la celebración de este debate urgente. Los debates urgentes son un mecanismo eficaz tanto para reforzar la función preventiva del Consejo de Derechos Humanos como para investigar y eventualmente confirmar la existencia de abusos y violaciones ya producidas. España ha votado a favor de este debate y participa activamente en el mismo como consecuencia de los alarmantes testimonios de la sociedad civil, especialmente defensores de derechos humanos, tras la celebración de las últimas elecciones presidenciales en el pasado mes de agosto. Estos testimonios se ven respaldados por el informe oral de la Alta Comisionada Adjunta, de la Relatora Especial para Bielorrusia y el comunicado conjunto de varios otros procedimientos especiales. Entre los abusos y violaciones de derechos humanos que se detallan en dichos testimonios, queremos llamar la atención sobre aquellos cometidos contra la integridad física y psicológica de las mujeres, niñas y niños, quienes sufren de manera desproporcionada los efectos de la pandemia actual. Por su gravedad y extensión, nos hacemos eco de las denuncias de torturas y violaciones de las mujeres manifestantes bielorrusas, así como de las detenciones y tratos vejatorios de menores de edad. Solicitamos a las autoridades bielorrusas que investiguen dichas denuncias y ejerzan su inherente función de promotores y protectores de los derechos humanos de sus propios ciudadanos. Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Muchas gracias. I give the floor to Germany.
Madam President, Germany is deeply worried about the deterioration of the human rights situation in Belarus. In the aftermath of the presidential election, we have witnessed unprecedented violence displayed by the Belarusian security forces against peaceful protesters. We observed serious restrictions on fundamental human rights, such as freedom of the media, freedom of speech, including through internet shutdowns, and on the right to peaceful assembly. We are alarmed by reports on arbitrary detentions of journalists, bloggers, human rights defenders, and peaceful protesters, including leaders of the Civil Society's Coordination Council. Germany expresses its solidarity with the Belarusian civil society that, in an admirable act of civic courage and peaceful protest, stands up for its democratic and human rights. We are shocked by reports on mistreatment and torture in police stations and prisons. Furthermore, the abduction of Maria Kolesnikova last week is completely unacceptable. Germany strongly condemns these violations of Belarus's international human rights obligations. We urge the Belarusian government to immediately release all peaceful protesters still in police custody or detention and to hold those responsible for human rights violations accountable. Madam President, this urgent debate gives the Council the opportunity to shed more light on the worrying situation in Belarus. Adopting a resolution enables this Council to send a strong signal and to closely monitor the human rights situation in Belarus in the context of the election. We call on the Belarusian government to fully cooperate with the OHCHR and to enter into a meaningful dialogue with civil society and political opposition in order to find peaceful, democratic and transparent solutions to overcome the current crisis. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Mexico.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Mi delegación participa en este debate urgente, preocupada por los múltiples informes sobre presuntas violaciones de derechos humanos ocurridas en el contexto de las protestas y manifestaciones realizadas en Belarus tras el proceso electoral en ese país. Escuchamos los pronunciamientos de la alta comisionada sobre la situación en Belarus y los comentarios de las delegaciones que tomaron la palabra al decidirse la realización de este debate urgente. Estimamos necesario dar seguimiento a las denuncias presentadas y asegurar una verdadera rendición de cuentas en aquellos casos en que se demuestre la existencia de violaciones de derechos humanos. México cree en la realización de elecciones periódicas, libres, justas y basadas en el sufragio universal y secreto. Considera valiosas las misiones de observación electoral, pues contribuyen a reforzar la confianza y la transparencia en los resultados. Al mismo tiempo, quiero subrayar que México es respetuoso de los procesos electorales de todos los estados. Independientemente del resultado del proceso electoral en Belarus, que no nos corresponde calificar, nos preocupa la información sobre detenciones arbitrarias, tortura y malos tratos, incluyendo violencia de género, así como las limitaciones a la libertad de expresión y asociación. Como lo señaló la alta comisionada, el uso de la fuerza durante las protestas debe ser siempre excepcional y una medida de último recurso, diferenciando claramente entre individuos violentos y manifestantes pacíficos contra quienes no se debe usar la fuerza por ningún motivo. Las autoridades estatales deben permitir y facilitar el ejercicio del derecho a la libertad de expresión y reunión pacífica y no reprimirlo. El pueblo de Belarus tiene derecho a hablar y expresar su desacuerdo, más aún en el contexto de las elecciones, cuando las libertades democráticas deben ser defendidas, no reprimidas. Hacemos un llamado a las autoridades de Belarus a respetar sus obligaciones de derechos humanos en el contexto del control de las manifestaciones y a investigar de manera independiente todas las presuntas violaciones de derechos humanos. Hacemos un llamado también a entablar un diálogo nacional sin precondiciones que permita a todas las partes bielorrusas expresar sus preocupaciones y alcanzar acuerdos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, embajadora. Y doy la palabra a Uruguay.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Uruguay ha votado en favor la convocatoria de este debate urgente, convencido de que el Consejo de Derechos Humanos debe ser siempre un escenario de diálogo entre los Estados para abordar situaciones que requieran su atención. Dicho esto, pensamos que debemos ceñirnos estrictamente a su mandato, que no es el de calificar o pronunciarse sobre los procesos electorales nacionales, ni cuenta con mecanismos o procedimientos para ello. De otra manera, se politizarían nuestras discusiones, desviándolas del tema central de nuestra preocupación, que es la vigencia de los derechos humanos y el cumplimiento de las obligaciones asumidas por los Estados en esta materia. En este sentido, debemos centrarnos en lo que ha venido informando la alta comisionada desde el comienzo de las protestas en Bielorrusia, denunciando el uso desmedido de la fuerza por parte de las autoridades bielorrusas contra los manifestantes, especialmente cuando se trata de manifestantes pacíficos. Uruguay rechaza estas violaciones de derechos humanos y libertades fundamentales consagradas en tratados internacionales de los que Bielorrusia forma parte. Es responsabilidad del Gobierno proteger la vida y la integridad física de su población ante cualquier acto de violencia. En consecuencia, es obligación de sus autoridades distinguir entre individuos violentos y los grupos pacíficos, evitando la violencia desmedida y los arrestos masivos y arbitrarios como los que presuntamente tuvieron lugar desde el comienzo de las protestas. Uruguay rechaza también las alegaciones de malos tratos y los actos de tortura mencionados por la alta comisionada, cometidos contra personas detenidas e incluyendo a periodistas y opositores al gobierno. Llamamos al gobierno de Bielorrusia a poner fin a estos actos contrarios a sus obligaciones internacionales y apostar por un diálogo sincero y constructivo entre gobierno, oposición y sociedad civil. Reiterando las palabras de la alta comisionada, el restablecimiento de la paz social en Bielorrusia requiere diálogo de largo alcance, reformas y rendición de cuentas por las serias violaciones de los derechos humanos que están teniendo lugar en el país. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, embajador. I give the floor to the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. The Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement. We wish to thank the Deputy UN High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur for their comprehensive presentations about the human rights situations in Belarus. We also thank other speakers, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Katerina Novikova, for their introductory remarks. The situation in Belarus has never been as appalling as in the past months. We are worried that it might continue to deteriorate. The recent presidential elections in Belarus were neither free nor fair. On top of that, a massive vote rigging took place. Belarusians were allowed to cast a ballot, but precinct election commissions never counted their votes. Their will for a political change has been neglected. The electoral process has shown that the Belarusian government limits the right of citizens to participate in public affairs. The right to protest peacefully, a pillar of democratic society, which can be exercised both in public and online, has not been respected. The response of Belarusian law enforcement agencies towards fellow Belarusians continues to be violent, intimidating, and disproportionate. There is an increasing number of reports about torture and ill treatment of people detained during the protests. Belarusian government proliferates state propaganda when necessary, pursues a blockade on internet communications, and prevents the dissemination of information. The rule of law has been violated on many occasions, but in the past weeks, lawlessness seems to have prevailed in the country. These developments highlight the crucial importance of independent media and strong civil society as a direct source of information and documentation on election frauds, lawlessness and brutality of security forces. We are gravely concerned over the reported harassment and persecution of members of the Coordination Council, renewed arrests of the representatives of civil society and participants of civil protests. We call on Belarusian political leadership to stop ignoring the will of its people for a change and to initiate a genuine and inclusive dialogue with the opposition and civil society on future political reconciliation in Belarus. This dialogue shall not be substituted by a constitutional process proposed and guided by Alexander Lukashenko. We expect the authorities to ensure immediate release of all detained on political grounds. That includes members of Pandadoc IT company management, members of the Coordination Council, Viktor Babarika, and members of his staff Serhii Tikhanovsky, and staff members of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and many more. In closing, the Czech Republic reiterates a strong readiness to support all initiatives aiming towards documentation of human rights violations. The continued scrutiny of this Council is, in our view, essential to prevent further deterioration of the situation. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next speaker is Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. The Brazilian government follows with great attention and concern the developments unfolding in the aftermath of the presidential elections held last August in Belarus. We are increasingly worried with accounts on the use of violence against peaceful demonstrators. Accusations of arbitrary detentions, torture, degrading treatment, expulsions, restrictions on the freedom of speech, and intimidation of political opponents have to be promptly and fully investigated. Brazil calls on all political forces in Belarus, as well as those that were forced to leave the country, to engage in a comprehensive and fruitful dialogue. Violence and lack of moderation are not conducive to a constructive process for the purpose of solving domestic tensions in a democratic and peaceful manner. We support the independence and sovereignty of Belarus, as well as its aspiration to a prosperous and democratic future. In that sense, we believe that a country's first and foremost responsibility is towards its own people. Brazil supports the draft resolution and urges the Belarusian government to fully respect the human and fundamental rights of its citizens. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Peru.
Expresa su preocupación por la situación de los derechos humanos en Belarus desde el proceso electoral del pasado 9 de agosto. La alta comisionada se ha referido a la continua represión de manifestaciones pacíficas de cientos de miles de personas por parte de fuerzas del orden, al uso excesivo de la fuerza, a los arrestos y detenciones arbitrarias, a las denuncias de torturas y malos tratos, a secuestros de miembros de la oposición y arrestos de periodistas. La señora Anaïs Marín, relatora especial sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en Belarus, ha señalado los límites de los derechos ciudadanos en este país, especialmente en lo relacionado con el derecho a participar en los asuntos públicos. El Perú está convencido de la importancia de iniciar un amplio, inclusivo y transparente proceso de diálogo que incluye a la sociedad civil y llama a todos los actores involucrados a que hagan esto posible. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted. Indonesia is the next speaker.
Madam President, the time-honored principle enshrined in the UN Charter, namely the respect of the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the political independence of all states should continue to be upheld by this Council. Furthermore, as stipulated in the resolution that established the Council, all states have the obligation and responsibility to protect their own people, including to ensure the protection and the promotion of human rights. In this connection, Indonesia is confident that the government of Belarus should take all necessary steps to de-escalate the situation and to refrain from using unnecessary and excessive use of force against civilian demonstrators and protesters. We would like to also take this opportunity to call upon the government of Belarus as the primary duty bearers to continue its effort to fulfill the highest attainable standard of human rights of all Belarusian citizens. The Human Rights Council, for its part, must take necessary steps to assist Belarus in their effort to strengthen the promotion and protection of human rights. As a long-standing and principled position, my delegation will continue to advocate constructive international dialogue and cooperation toward the betterment of human rights, including in Belarus. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. Since the presidential election in Belarus on August 9, large-scale protests have been continuing, and clashes with security forces have led to casualties and detention of participants of these protests. Japan has been closely monitoring the situation with concern. Japan is seriously concerned about the situation in which many participants of peaceful protests continue to be detained and political activists who seek dialogue with the authorities, such as Ms. Maria Kolesnikova, are being successively detained. Japan has been urging the authorities of Belarus to immediately cease the arbitrary detention and forceful oppression of citizens conducting peaceful protests, as well as to engage in national dialogue that respects the principles of the rule of law and democracy. However, the situation has not improved. The government of Japan once again strongly urges the Belarusian authorities to make an earnest effort in addressing this situation. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Italy.
Thank you, Madam President. Italy aligns itself with the EU statement. Madam President, we welcome the convening of this debate, which takes place at an appropriate time in light of the recent developments in Minsk. The human rights situation in Belarus continues to be a source of concern. Along with partners, we continue to condemn violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of peaceful assembly and association and freedom of opinion and expression, both online and offline, as well as acts of repression against members of the opposition forces, civil society, human rights, including women, and all those peacefully voicing their protest after the elections, as well as the intimidation against journalists and other media workers. We reiterate our non-recognition of the outcome of the presidential elections due to numerous manipulations and irregularities before and during the elections. To that end, we are ready to support an inclusive constitutional reform process in full respect of Belarus' independence and sovereignty, and we call on all international stakeholders to follow the same constructive approach in the sole interest of the Belarusian people. The current crisis in Belarus is about their legitimate aspirations for a better, brighter future, and we believe that the international community shares the interest to avoid a violent escalation in the country or a regional destabilization. For these reasons, we renew our call on the Belarusian authorities to follow the path of dialogue with the opposition forces, releasing all political detainees and making meaningful effort to engage in meaningful national dialogue and in a credible and inclusive constitution, all reform process as a stepping stone towards free and fair elections. And we commend the Belarusian opposition and civil society's moderate and peaceful action to that end. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to the Philippines.
Thank you, Madam President. The Human Rights Council has taken a decision to convene an urgent debate on the human rights situation in Belarus. The Philippines believes that it is in the interest of the Belarusian people and Republic that the political situation evolves in a peaceful manner and is resolved in accordance with its national laws and processes. We acknowledge the importance of the voice of civil society in this internal political process. As a democracy, the Philippines puts supreme value in the national dialogue that respects the views and rights of all sides, fosters harmony, and brings the situation to a conclusion that upholds the sovereignty of the Republic and the welfare of all Belarusian people. During this urgent debate, the Human Rights Council has to fulfill its mandate in line with the principles in the UN Charter of respect for national sovereignty and non-intervention in domestic political processes. The Philippines calls on the Human Rights Council to exercise due prudence in intentions and actions that bring us to the precipice of digressing from the basic tenets of international relations, which underpin the multilateralism that we so need to work for humanity at this time. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Eritrea.
Thank you, Madam President. Eritrea remains concerned by the protracted politicization of the Human Rights Council mechanisms and attendant agendas with negative precedence to the effectiveness of the international human rights architecture. Most often, the mandates and arrangements do not enjoy the consent of the concerned state and fail to create any dividend in the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The lessons learned are enough to pursue the lofty ideals of dignified engagements and cooperation based on partnership. A quick glance at the report of almost all country-specific mandate holders proves that the accused as being presumed guilty and charged without any objective verification. The Council and Member States lack the ground to verify information and hold mandates accountable in line to the UN principles and the attendant conduct of the mandate holders. The information that led to the urgent debate today at hand is mostly influenced by the special rapporteur that continues to report from outside the country and other sources that the government considers bogus and biased. In response today, the delegation of the government of Belarus, and in its previous rebuttal, had criticized the special rapporteur for lack of objectivity and impartiality to undermine outstanding achievements. Madam President, Eritrea encourages the government of Belarus to address prevailing post-election situation in line with international standards and with national interests and ownership that is far beyond the reach of the current debate. In the context, while Eritrea stands with victims of any violation, it does not support the politicized approach and the decisions that do not create any dividend in addressing the prevailing situation and the promotion of human rights and freedom of human dignity. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And we will now proceed with the list of observer states of the Council, and starting again with statements by dignitaries. The first video we'll listen to will be by Her Excellency Mrs. Wendy Morton, Minister for European Neighbourhood and the Americas of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
We welcome this urgent debate, which provides an important opportunity to draw the Council's attention to and act with resolve on the current situation in Belarus. The United Kingdom does not accept the results of the fraudulent presidential election in Belarus. We condemn the excessive use of force by the authorities against peaceful protesters, the targeting and detention of journalists, and the expulsion of opposition figures. We continue to call on the government of Belarus to respect the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly and association and freedom of expression for all, including for journalists and media workers. We've called for an independent OSCE investigation into the fraudulent election processes and related human rights violations. The UK also supports imposing sanctions against those responsible. We are working with our international partners to hold the Belarusian authorities to account. The UK is doubling its financial support to independent media, human rights organisations and community groups in Belarus, with an extra £1.5 million for project work over the next 2 years. The authorities in Belarus must enter into a constructive dialogue with the opposition and people of Belarus. It is vital that the Belarusian people are heard and can determine their country's future.
Thank you very much. And next is His Excellency Mr. Urmas Reinsalu, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Estonia.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished High Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Maintaining peace depends also on how states treat their own citizens, and is the road to a less violent world. The unfolding tragedy in Belarus is proof of that. Estonia strongly condemns the crackdown on peaceful protesters before and since the presidential election on 9th August in Belarus. Continued one-sided mass violence and brutality by the authorities against peaceful demonstrators is a crime against its own citizens and must stop immediately. Belarusian authorities refuse to begin national dialogue and are speaking to their people in the language of repressions and arrests. Svetlana Alexeyevich, the last member of the Coordination Council who has not been arrested or forced into exile, has accurately said, "First they stole our country, now they are stealing the best of us." To assure her safety, EU diplomats based in Minsk are currently watching over her day and night. We call for an independent, transparent and thorough investigation into abuses committed before and after the presidential vote, and for those responsible to be held to account. We insist that Belarus cooperates fully with the Special Rapporteur by granting her free, full and unhindered access to the territory of the country, including unhindered access to all places of detention. Thus, let us speak up for and let us not lose interest in the suffering of the Belarusian people. Human rights have to prevail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is His Excellency Mr. Edgars Rinkēvičs, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia.
More than a month after the presidential elections in Belarus, that were neither free nor fair, we continue to witness systematic breach of fundamental rights and freedoms of the Belarusian people. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported about arrests, detentions, forced disappearances, violence against women, and serious allegations of torture. Belarus has an obligation to respect and protect the rights of its citizens. We urge Belarusian authorities to stop detention of journalists and repression against the civil society. People in Belarus have the right to access to internet and information. Sustainable solutions can only be achieved through democratic and peaceful process. We support and will continue to support the civil society, human rights defenders, and Belarusian people in their struggle for democracy. We urge the Belarusian authorities to engage in meaningful dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We call upon the United Nations Special Rapporteurs on media freedom and torture, on human rights defenders, and on violence against women to hold missions to Belarus. We align ourselves with the EU statement and invite the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a report on the human rights situation in Belarus. To this aim, we invite the High Commissioner to establish a UN human rights monitoring mission in Belarus.
Thank you very much. Et maintenant, nous écoutons Son Excellence Monsieur Jean Asselborn, ministre des Affaires étrangères et européennes du Luxembourg.
Madame la Présidente, le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. De toute évidence, les élections présidentielles du 9 août au Bélarus n'ont pas été conformes aux normes et aux standards internationaux. Lorsque les citoyens du Bélarus sont descendus dans la rue pour manifester et réclamer le respect de leurs droits, ils ont été confrontés à une répression d'une violence inouïe de la part des autorités. Les rapports faisant état de torture et d'humiliation systématiques dans les postes de police et les prisons biélorusses sont très accablants. Toute la lumière doit être faite sur les violations des droits humains et justice doit être rendue aux victimes. L'état de droit, des élections libres et équitables et le droit de se réunir pacifiquement sont essentiels à la liberté, à la stabilité et à la sécurité de nos sociétés. Le peuple du Bélarus a les mêmes droits universels que les autres peuples et mérite de les voir protégés. Je salue l'élaboration d'une résolution sur la situation des droits humains au Bélarus et j'encourage tous les membres du Conseil à l'adopter. Ce Conseil doit faire entendre sa voix pour soutenir celles et ceux qui s'engagent avec beaucoup de courage pour les droits humains au Bélarus. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. And I give the floor to Mr. Linas Linkevičius, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania.
Madam President, the situation of human rights in Belarus raises our deepest concern. Brutal manifestation of mass violence and imprisonment of peaceful demonstrators, including minors and journalists, ongoing repression of the political opposition and civil society during and after the presidential campaign and the election are deeply disturbing. Institutionalized torture, enforced disappearances, alleged instances of sexual and gender-based violence, killings have to be stopped immediately and investigated. Police officers responsible for the humiliation of protesters must be brought to justice. International community must react jointly, forcefully, and urgently to the situation on the ground. As a one concrete action, we should begin an international investigation on human rights violations and crimes, and the Human Rights Council must remain seized on the matter. We also urge Belarus to fully cooperate with all UN special procedures and human rights mechanisms, in particular with the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus, granting free, full and unhindered access to its territory. Once again, Lithuania reminds Belarus to hold genuinely democratic election, to secure human rights and fundamental freedoms, to stop immediately any assault against peaceful protesters and journalists, including their unlawful detainment, imprisonment and torture.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Mr. Bogdan Aurescu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania.
Madam President, Romania aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. We share the deep concern about the violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms by the authorities in Belarus and deplore the breach of the international law on human rights. We applaud the courage of the Belarusian people, who despite all odds have taken the streets to denounce the result of the presidential elections, which were neither free nor fair, and to ask that their civil and political rights be upheld. At the same time, we condemn the disproportionate use of force by the authorities against peaceful protesters, journalists, and members of the opposition, the limitations on the right to peaceful assembly and on the freedom of expression, and the cases of unlawful detention. Romania has contributed with 100,000 euros from our development and humanitarian assistance budget through the European Endowment for Democracy in support of civil society and independent journalism in Belarus. Madam President, we urge the Belarusian authorities to refrain from further violations of human rights, to uphold their obligations and enable independent, transparent and impartial investigations into all allegations of human rights violations, to ensure access to justice, redress to victims, and accountability for perpetrators. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as the last dignitary, we'll listen to Mr. Simon Coveney, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ireland.
Welcomes the holding of this urgent debate to address the serious deterioration in the human rights situation in Belarus, and thanks the High Commissioner and other speakers for their interventions. Since the presidential elections last month, which were neither free nor fair, we have seen unacceptable state violence against peaceful protesters, resulting in severe injuries and loss of life, arbitrary detentions, crackdowns on civil society, human rights defenders, and the media and internet shutdowns. Ireland unreservedly condemns all these actions and joins those calling for them to stop immediately. Events in Belarus in the last few weeks show a complete disregard for the principles of the Charter and human rights. We must be clear: the violence, falsified elections, and the curtailments of freedom of expression, association, and assembly are unacceptable. It is vital that the human rights and democratic will of the Belarusian people are respected. Ireland has noted the active role of women in the protests and calls for a proactive inclusion of female leaders in future negotiations. Ireland shares the concern of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Belarus, and we regret the Belarusian authorities continue to deny her access to the country in her official capacity. We urge the Belarusian authorities to quickly grasp with both hands the offer of the OSCE chair to visit Minsk and facilitate a national dialogue.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to UN Women.
Thank you, Madam President. UN Women is deeply concerned about the use of violence against women in political and public life in Belarus and the detention of women who are exercising their fundamental rights to peaceful protest. We call on authorities to stop the violence and allow full monitoring and pursuit of investigations of alleged human rights violations to ensure accountability. Women play a vital role in political processes throughout the world and are also playing a central role in the recent peaceful protests in Belarus. Several prominent opposition leaders are women, as are many of the protesters. UN Women is highly concerned that UN Women human rights experts have received at least 450 documented cases of torture or ill treatment while in police custody, including against women detainees. Reports were also received about violence against women and children, including sexual abuse and rape. Additionally, UN Women is concerned regarding the alleged intimidation, abduction, and attempted or successful arbitrary expulsion from Belarus of women politicians and female opposition leaders by security agents. Violence against women in political and public life is a violation of women's equal civil and political rights. UN Women recognizes that actions and threats of sexual violence and torture can further serve to prevent women from exercising and realizing their political rights. Any violence must cease and allegations are investigated to ensure accountability. UN Women supports...
Thank you very much. Time's up. I give the floor to Finland.
Finland aligns itself with the intervention by the European Union. Finland has grave concerns about the alarming human rights situation in Belarus. We are deeply worried about violence against peaceful demonstrators and torture and cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment of ordinary people. We urge Belarusian government and authorities to stop harassment and detention of political opponents, human rights defenders, civil society representatives, journalists and other media workers, as well as forced exiles, and to immediately release all those detained on political grounds and bring those responsible to justice. The rights to freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly must be respected in all circumstances. We call upon the Belarusian government to engage without delay in a genuine political dialogue with the opposition and civil society in order to find a peaceful solution to the crisis. As stated in the joint statement of the Nordic countries, we stand in solidarity with the Belarusian people in the request for democracy and rights to be respected, and strongly support the adoption of the presented resolution today. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement and is seriously concerned about the human rights situation in Belarus following the country's presidential elections, which were neither free nor fair. We are deeply concerned about the reports of the ongoing violence, excessive use of force by law enforcement, torture and ill treatment, abductions and forced disappearances, arbitrary arrests and detentions, denial of the rights to peaceful assembly, to information and to freedom of opinion and expression taking place in Belarus. In this regard, we support the High Commissioner's call for prompt, thorough, independent and impartial investigations into all allegations of human rights violations. As a state party to core human rights instruments, Belarus has obligations to respect human rights. We are appalled by the intimidation, harassment and attacks on members of political opposition, as well as human rights defenders, civil society representatives, journalists and other media workers and people seeking to peacefully exercise their civil and political rights. Belarusian authorities must engage in a genuine dialogue, carry out reforms and ensure accountability for the grave human rights violations. We call on Belarus to fully cooperate with all human rights mechanisms, including the Special Rapporteur on Belarus, other special procedures and treaty bodies, as well as with numerous regional mechanisms of the OSCE and the Council of Europe. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the European Union for the request of an urgent debate on the situation of human rights in Belarus in relation to the 2020 presidential elections. We regret that the government of Belarus did not carry out free and fair presidential elections and ignored repeatedly raised concerns with regard to the detention of prospective candidates, irregularities related to the candidate registration, including the lack of transparency in the process of verification of signatures, the limited independent monitoring of elections, as well as the intimidation and detention of journalists and other media actors, human rights defenders and political activists. We are alarmed by the post-electoral situation in Belarus, in particular by the unacceptable and excessive use of violence of Belarusian law enforcement against peaceful protesters, including minors and journalists, the drastic limitations imposed on civil society activities and on the freedom of media, both online and offline, as well as other serious human rights violations and fundamental freedoms. We urge the Belarusian authorities to refrain from further violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms and to release immediately and unconditionally all unlawfully detained persons, including particularly those detained on political grounds. We also urge them to conduct independent investigations on all human rights violations, including cases of enforced disappearances and alleged cases of torture and ill treatment of detainees, and to ensure that all perpetrators of such crimes are held accountable. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Canada.
Madam President, Canada categorically condemns the ongoing human rights violations throughout Belarus following the fraudulent presidential elections. Among other violations, we have witnessed violence against peaceful protesters and arbitrary detention of journalists and individuals exercising the right to freedom of assembly and expression. We are seriously concerned by significant and targeted repression against prominent opposition members, including abductions and expulsion of members of the Coordination Council from Belarus. We stress that meaningful and inclusive dialogue between the Belarusian authorities and the opposition is critical to peacefully resolving the current crisis. We ask the government of Belarus to refrain from further violence and to immediately release all who have been unjustly detained. The authorities have a responsibility to investigate all instances and all reports of human rights violations, including the credible allegations of sexual and gender-based violence, torture, and cruel treatment of detainees. The government of Belarus must uphold its international responsibilities and obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the UN Convention Against Torture for all its citizens. Canada remains committed to the people of Belarus. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Что группа агрессивно настроенных государств в очередной раз навязала Совету предвзятую и политизированную дискуссию. Невмешательство во внутренние дела суверенных государств – базовый принцип международного права. Выборы в Беларуси – внутреннее дело этой страны. Заявление инициаторов сегодняшнего обсуждения о нарушениях прав человека в Беларуси – это не что иное, как попытка через давление, угрозы и политические заявления дестабилизировать ситуацию в стране и спровоцировать в ней политический кризис. Так, как это они уже сделали в соседней с Белоруссией стране. Чтобы убедиться в этом, достаточно прочесть проект резолюции, который они подготовили. Здесь немало и цветисто говорилось про нарушения в ходе массовых демонстраций, но давайте посмотрим, почему-то из-за массовых арестов и столкновений с полицией во Франции и Германии спецсессии СПЧ не собирали, а продолжающиеся беспрецедентные протесты в США пострадало и было арестовано куда больше людей, а поборники прав человека почему-то по этому поводу молчат. Призываю всех задаться вопросом, кому и зачем нужно искусственное нагнетание вокруг Белоруссии? Ответ очевиден. Определенные силы стремятся превратить еще одно государство в некое образование, раздираемое внутренними противоречиями. Благодарю вас.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to UNICEF.
It's the opportunity to bring attention to the impact of the political unrest on the rights of children and adolescents in Belarus. UNICEF is concerned with the numerous reports of excessive use of force by law enforcement officials during protests and in places of detention, including against children. UNICEF is also concerned with reports of 240 adolescents facing administrative charges for engaging in largely peaceful demonstrations and wishes to recall that as per the Convention on the Rights of the Child, every child has the right to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and that children's views must be given due weight. Further arrest, detention, or imprisonment of a child are to be used only as measures of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time. Legal guardians must be promptly informed and be allowed to be present throughout judicial and administrative procedures. Madam President, UNICEF urges the authorities and all parties to fully respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of all children everywhere across the country at all times, in accordance with international human rights law. UNICEF continues to monitor the situation closely and stands ready to support all actions that protect and promote the rights of children in Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Je donne la parole à la Belgique.
Madam President, while the Belarusian people aspired nothing but the exercise of their democratic rights, the presidential election process they invested was neither free nor fair. The reaction of the security forces to popular and peaceful protests after the fraudulent elections is disproportionate and violent. Hundreds of cases of torture are reported. Freedom of opinion and expression is dramatically curtailed. Opposition leaders either had to flee for their lives, were arrested, kept incommunicado, or disappeared after abduction. Thousands of citizens are imprisoned on purely political grounds. Hundreds of them are missing. Governments that rule by fear live in fear. The Belarusian government fears the fair judgment of its own population. But accountability is and will be asked for the grave violations. It is clear that the only sustainable way out of the impasse is through dialogue and mediation, an offer which has been extended by regional organizations, but has so far regrettably been rejected by the government of Belarus. Belarusians have woken up. We applaud in particular the courage of Belarusian women.
I'm sorry, Ambassador, time is up. Doy la palabra a Cuba.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Cuba reafirma su apoyo al pueblo y gobierno de Belarus y a su legítimo presidente, Alexander Lukashenko. Rechazamos enérgicamente la injerencia extranjera contra la soberanía y autodeterminación de ese hermano país. Señora presidenta, Cuba rechaza la imposición de este tipo de iniciativas selectivas contra países con claras motivaciones políticas. Estamos ante un claro intento de usar el Consejo y los mecanismos de derechos humanos para legitimar un golpe de Estado en un país soberano y hacer avanzar la agenda injerencista de Estados Unidos y algunos de sus aliados. Señora presidenta, este debate y el proyecto de resolución que lo acompaña son una muestra más de la politización y los dobles raseros que imperan en el tratamiento de los derechos humanos. Esto no hará sino continuar lacerando la credibilidad del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Doy la palabra a Nicaragua.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Lamentamos nuevamente que este Consejo de Derechos Humanos esté siendo utilizado como una herramienta de politización para agredir la soberanía de algunos estados. Nuestro gobierno reconoce y agradece la voluntad del gobierno de Belarus en trabajar con los mecanismos de este Consejo, así como con la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada. Por otro lado, es importante resaltar que las acciones que se están tomando el día de hoy en contra de Belarus sientan un peligroso precedente de injerencia en los procesos electorales de los Estados miembros de la ONU, además de un evidente intento de agresión a la decisión soberana y democrática de un pueblo. Este debate es sin duda una injerencia directa a los asuntos internos de Belarus y una violación del derecho internacional. Señora presidenta, casi la mitad de los miembros de este Consejo no apoyaron la propuesta de un debate urgente para Belarus. Nuestra muestra inequívoca del desacuerdo respecto a este tipo de iniciativas que no contribuyen al desarrollo de ningún país ni promueven el ambiente de cooperación constructiva y el respeto entre los Estados. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. I give the floor to China.
主席女士，中国反对人权理事会举行针对白俄罗斯的紧急辩论。中国尊重白俄罗斯人民根据本国国情选择的发展道路，坚定支持白俄罗斯方面为维护国家独立、主权、安全和发展做出的努力。我们反对外部势力对白俄罗斯社会制造分裂和动荡。我们希望并相信，白俄罗斯能够通过自己的努力，保持政局稳定和社会安宁。我们一向主张通过建设性的对话与合作，妥善处理人权领域里的分歧。我们反对公开施压和将人权问题政治化的做法，反对任何国家打着保护人权的幌子干涉白俄内政。人权理事会应当秉持联合国宪章宗旨和原则，公正客观行事。有关工作应当有利于白俄罗斯保持稳定，有利于得到问题得到妥善的解决，而不是相反。谢谢主席女士。
Thank you, Ambassador. We now listen to a video from Sweden.
Madam President, Sweden aligns itself with the statement by the EU and the joint Nordic statement. We thank the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur for the information and the panelists for their testimonies. The election on 9 August was neither free nor fair. Therefore, we do not recognize the results. Sweden is alarmed by the human rights violations, which include arbitrary detention, torture, and other forms of ill treatment of and brutal violence against opposition and peaceful protesters committed by the Belarusian authorities. The arrest and the forced exile of opposition leaders is a serious attempt to undermine the democratic will of the people to exercise their rights. As all those arbitrarily detained must be immediately and unconditionally released. We urge the Belarusian authorities
to fulfill their obligations under international human rights law and to hold those responsible for violations accountable. As a party to the ILO core conventions, Belarus must immediately end politically motivated prosecutions of members of labor unions and strike committees. Sweden stands in solidarity with the people in Belarus in their desire to exercise their human rights and their demand for new and democratic elections. We continue to call on the Belarusian leadership to initiate a genuine dialogue with the Belarusian opposition. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Et je donne la parole à la Suisse.
Merci Madame la Présidente. La Suisse salue la tenue de ce débat urgent sur la situation actuelle des droits de l'homme au Bélarus. La Suisse est particulièrement préoccupée par la répression violente envers les manifestations pacifiques dans le pays en lien avec les élections controversées du 9 août dernier. Elle condamne l'usage excessif de la force de la part des forces de sécurité à l'encontre des manifestants, ainsi que les nombreuses arrestations et détentions arbitraires. Les allégations de torture et de traitements cruels, inhumains ou dégradants de la part des forces de sécurité et d'agents pénitentiaires sont alarmantes. Enfin, les attaques contre la presse et les journalistes constituent des actes graves qui ne sauraient être tolérés. La Suisse presse les autorités bélarussiennes de libérer les personnes arrêtées arbitrairement dans le pays. Elle les prie instamment de permettre des enquêtes indépendantes, transparentes et impartiales sur toutes les allégations de violation des droits de l'homme liées au contexte électoral et de traduire les responsables en justice. La Suisse appelle les autorités à collaborer avec les mécanismes internationaux des droits de l'homme, dont le Conseil et ses mécanismes. Elle salue le suivi de la situation par le Haut-Commissariat prévu dans la résolution qui accompagne ce débat urgent. Enfin, la Suisse appelle les parties au dialogue afin de trouver une solution à cette crise. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. I give the floor to Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. We have been closely following the developments in Belarus and are deeply concerned about the rapid deterioration of the human rights situation following the presidential elections of 9 August. The disturbing scenes of violence and repression against peaceful protesters, many of whom women, are difficult to reconcile with the obligations of states under international human rights law. In their various statements, the High Commissioner and Special Procedures mandate holders cite alarming reports of violence against people seeking to peacefully exercise their civil and political rights, against political opponents, human rights defenders, civil society representatives, journalists, and media workers. We share the High Commissioner's assessment that re-establishing social peace in Belarus requires far-reaching dialogue, reforms, and accountability for grave human rights violations. Albania and Sweden, in their capacity as respectively current and incoming chair in office of the OSCE, have offered their good offices to the Belarusian authorities with a view to facilitating the much-needed dialogue to help Belarus out of this increasingly worrying situation. We call on the Belarusian authorities to enable independent, transparent, and impartial investigations into all allegations of human rights violations in relation to the 2020 presidential elections, and to grant free, full, and unhindered access to the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Egypt.
شكرا سيدة الرئيس. تعرب مصر عن رفضها المبدئي لتسييس حقوق الإنسان واستغلالها للتدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول، وتؤكد أهمية الالتزام بمبادئ العالمية والموضوعية وعدم الانتقائية والقضاء على المعايير المزدوجة عند النظر في قضايا حقوق الإنسان. وتأسف مصر لقيام المجلس بالموافقة على عقد جلسة النقاش العاجل دون موافقة الدولة المعنية، والسعي لاستصدار قرار جديد رغم وجود قرار سنوي للمجلس اتصالا بالوضع في بيلاروسيا. وترى مصر أهمية تغليب لغة الحوار وإجراء نقاش حقيقي مع الدولة المعنية دون استخدام المجلس كأداة ضغط، مع إيلاء عناية ببناء قدرات المؤسسات الوطنية والتعاون الفني. وتؤكد مصر في هذا السياق احترامها الكامل لإرادة الشعوب وتطلعاتها المشروعة نحو تحقيق الديمقراطية والاستقرار، مع أهمية الحفاظ على الطابع السلمي في جميع الأوقات والنهي عن أعمال العنف. وشكرا سيدة الرئيس.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. The Islamic Republic of Iran reiterates the strong need for the Council to fulfill its mandates in protection and promotion of human rights on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation, in strict adherence to the principles of non-selectivity, objectivity, and impartiality, and without submitting to politicization or double standard. The human rights mechanisms, and principally this Council, should be kept away from politicization and political prejudices towards any country. As a matter of principle, solidly based on the UN Charter and well established under international law, the sovereignty as well as the right of all nations to freely determine their political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development shall be respected without undue external interference and pressure. We appreciate the efforts of the Belarusian authorities to resolve domestic political disputes, including through establishing national investigation mechanisms and by undertaking national dialogue. We disapprove of holding this urgent debate without the consent of the concerned state. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Turkey.
Madam President, we consider Belarusian people as our true friends. We care about the well-being of the whole country. We are therefore concerned with the developments in Belarus. Today, as in the past, preservation of political and economic stability in Belarus should be a major objective for us. This does not contradict with our support for the democratic process. This can be achieved through an inclusive national dialogue. At this point, exercise of common sense, self-restraint by all is crucial. As the international community, by showing empathy and prudence, we can keep our role within a constructive framework. Surely we are cognizant of the legitimate democratic aspirations in Belarus. Our objective should be to facilitate a Belarusian-led and Belarusian-owned process. Obviously, one-size-fits-all solutions would not work, given the country's circumstances at this point. Strong rhetoric from the outside without realistic policy tools can be counterproductive. This does not mean compromising on human rights. The final objective is still more democracy and human rights. We do not condone some of the shortcomings of the democratic process that we have seen in various reports, but we should genuinely try to help the Belarus government to address these. Democratic and stable Belarus is vital for peace and stability of the region and entire Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to the DPRK.
Thank you, Madam President. DPRK delegation is deeply concerned over and oppose any practice and attempts for interference and pressure upon sovereign state under the pretext of human rights. Each country has the right to select and determine freely political, economic, and social system in accordance with the will and demands of its people. The Belarusian people is able to re-establish political stability independently with its constructive political forces and relevant institutions. That's why the situation in Belarus does not require outside interference. Despite this fact, this debate established a dangerous precedent of the interference in the electoral process of UN member states via misuse of rules of procedure of Human Rights Council. It is obviously selective and politically motivated approach against Belarus and proves itself that it is another attempt to manipulate the Human Rights Council in its own political interest. We strongly urge HRC to encourage genuine dialogue and cooperation with the states, carry out work based on its mandates in an objective and impartial manner, and stand against politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Iceland.
Thank you, Madam President. Iceland aligns itself with the Nordic 5 joint statement in this debate. The recent election in Belarus was neither free nor fair. The subsequent use of widespread violence against peaceful demonstrators, journalists, and other media workers has been deeply troubling. Harassment, persecution, and unlawful detention of political activists, human rights defenders, and others must be condemned. Freedom of speech, freedom of the media, and the right to peacefully demonstrate are universal rights. that must be protected and respected in all circumstances. Madam President, all perpetrators of human rights violations must be held accountable. We urge Belarusian authorities to release unlawfully detained persons and support efforts to conduct an independent and transparent investigation into allegations of torture, sexual and gender-based violence, and other ill treatment of detained persons. We will continue to support a democratic, independent and prosperous Belarus and call on the current government to initiate a dialogue that will contribute to that end, as well as foster a new climate of respect for human rights and democracy. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Norway.
Thank you, Madam President. The human rights situation in Belarus is troubling and needs our urgent attention. We are observing ongoing violence by the security forces against unarmed, peaceful protesters and mass arrest of media workers and protesters. Brave women play an important part in the peaceful response to the security forces' brutal and indiscriminate behavior. They are met with violence and detentions, but their voices will not be silenced. They are courageous and determined. We call on the Belarusian authorities to stop the harassment of striking workers and independent trade unions. We call for a thorough, independent and transparent investigation into the allegations of torture and other ill treatment of people in detention. All perpetrators of human rights violations must be held accountable. The authorities' campaign to silence the Coordination Council and its members is unacceptable. The Belarusian government must pursue dialogue, not repression. We urge the authorities to engage with the current and incoming OSCE chairpersonship in facilitating an inclusive and national dialogue in the country. We support all efforts to peacefully end the crisis, and we will continue to support a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous and stable Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Laos.
Thank you, Madam President. The Lapudia thanks Belarus for sharing information on current situation in the country following the presidential election and strongly hopes that the internal situation will be solved. The Lapudia also notes with the achievement made in the development of human rights in Belarus, including through cooperation with international community, especially UN human rights mechanism. Madam President, we underscore the significant role of UN human rights mechanisms in delivering concrete and meaningful human rights impact on the ground. We therefore wish to emphasize that the human rights mechanism should not be used as a tool to interfere in the internal affairs of the state, and human rights issues must be addressed within global context through a constructive, non-confrontational, non-politicized, non-selective, and dialogue-based approach in a fair and equal manner with activity, respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-interference with internal affairs of the state and impartiality. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Moldova.
Thank you, Madam President. The Republic of Moldova has been closely following the post-electoral developments in Belarus, the situation being of imminent concern in the region. We are particularly concerned by reported cases of violence. Reiterating the importance of respecting human rights and internationally accepted democratic norms, we hope that the difficulties faced during these days by the Belarusian people will be overcome peacefully in the framework of an authentic and inclusive dialogue. During this hard time, we express our solidarity with the people of Belarus. The Republic of Moldova values its partnership with the Republic of Belarus, our two countries enjoying a good friendship relation based on strong ties between our people. In this respect, we will continue to give our full support towards the consolidation of democracy, prosperity, stability, and independence of the Republic of Belarus. Based on the above-mentioned solidarity and with a view to restoring stability and creating an environment of credibility and trust for the inclusive dialogue, we hope for a peaceful and democratic way out of the current difficult and challenging crisis situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Myanmar. That's a video.
Madam President, Myanmar thanks the delegation of Belarus for the statement. We take note with appreciation of the earnest implementation made by Belarus on its national human rights frameworks, We welcome the declaration by the President of Belarus of his intention to undertake political transformation through a national dialogue and referendum on the Constitution. Madam President, the issue raised here today is clearly an internal affair of Belarus. Exerting undue pressure on a nation for political purposes will not solve any challenge the country concerned faced. The member state must refrain from interfering in internal affairs of others. We are of the view that to address the human rights challenges effectively and productively, the member state must engage with the concerned country through an objective and constructive manner. Promotion and protection of human rights for all should be based on the principles of universality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and avoidance of double standards and politicization. We are confident that the government of Belarus will be able to solve the prevailing challenges. We ask the international community to support the government of Belarus in its endeavors to promote and protect the human rights. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Portugal.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Commissioner and the other speakers for their interventions too. Portugal aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We have been following with great concern the human rights situation in Belarus in the aftermath of the presidential elections. The extent of human rights violations and lack of rule of law is not tolerable after elections that were not free and fair. The people of Belarus have nevertheless demonstrated the desire for democratic change. The repression which we are witnessing and the state's violence against peaceful protesters is unacceptable. Thousands of people were unlawfully detained and the rights to freedom of assembly, media and expression seriously repressed. We call on Belarus's authorities to avoid violence and immediately release all unlawfully detained. The protection of civil society and opposition figures must also be guaranteed. It is also fundamental that Belarus fully cooperates with the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to New Zealand.
Thank you, Madam President. New Zealand is deeply concerned about the deterioration in the human rights situation in Belarus since the presidential election in August. In particular, we share the international community's concerns about the serious violations of human rights that have taken place since the election, including violent suppression and repressive tactics against peaceful demonstrators, opposition candidates and civil society. New Zealand takes this opportunity to reaffirm that universal human rights such as freedom of expression and the right to peaceful demonstration must be protected, not suppressed. New Zealand calls on Belarus to uphold its obligations under international human rights law by ensuring a safe environment for peaceful demonstrations and freedom of expression, as well as for the conduct of free, fair and transparent elections. New Zealand welcomes the Council attention on this issue and joins the Council in encouraging Belarus to work with the international community to address these concerns. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Tajikistan.
Thank you, Madam President. We closely following the situation in Belarus during presidential elections and after these results. The development of the situation around the presidential campaign received an important international attention. The mission of observation organized by the Executive Committee of the Commonwealth of Independent States monitored the presidential elections to 2020 in Belarus and did not produce any negative conclusion on the way they were carried out. The situation in Belarus do not require outside interference or mediation. The Belarusian people is able, through the constructive political forces and the relevant institution, to re-establish independently the national consensus and to decide on the future political development. Thus, there is no need to discuss the situation of human rights in Belarus during either in the form of urgent or planned debates. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Greece.
Greece allies itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur for the information provided. We have been following the latest developments in Belarus with great concern and are convinced that the holding of this urgent debate is both timely and pertinent. The August presidential elections were neither free nor fair. The resulting political crisis caused an unprecedented surge of violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms. We are alarmed by reports of widespread torture and cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment of peaceful protesters, arbitrary detentions of opposition leaders and human rights defenders, repression of freedom of expression, both offline and online, and internet shutdowns. Reports of attacks and intimidation against journalists and media professionals are of particular concern to Greece. We call on Belarusian authorities to refrain by all means from the further use of violence against civilians and to release those arbitrarily detained. Moreover, all grave human rights violations must be investigated in an impartial, thorough and transparent manner. Greece believes that further scrutiny by the Human Rights Council and the mechanisms is both warranted and necessary. Belarus must live up to its international commitments and show full respect for human rights and the rule of law, which are necessary foundations for prosperity and political stability. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Cambodia.
Madam President, my delegation takes note of relevant reports as to the situation in Belarus, including the most recent election, as well as the constructive cooperation with human rights mechanism and the OHCHR. Cambodia is of the view that the Belarusian people are in the best position through their national dialogues and institutions to re-establish the national consensus and to decide on the future political development. Madam President, the enduring strength of all human rights mechanisms lie in the even-handed approaches with transparency, objectivity, and impartiality, as well as in full adherence to the principle of sovereign equality and non-interference, which are well enshrined in the UN Charter. Their activities should be guided by the objective of achieving healthy international cooperation rather than naming and shaming. Finally, Cambodia reiterated its principal positions that human rights agenda must be addressed through genuine dialogue-based approach with non-confrontation, non-politicization, and non-selectivity, based on verified sources of information and bearing in mind the national particularity of each country. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Croatia.
Thank you, Madam President. Croatia aligns with the EU statement. We thank the Deputy High Commissioner and Special Rapporteur for their assessments and to other speakers that shared alarming first-hand information with us. Croatia regrets that despite the desire for democratic change, electoral process for presidential elections in Belarus was blocked by neither free nor fair elections. People of Belarus were denied the right to choose their leaders and determine their own fate. We find particularly troublesome the Belarus authorities' practice of persecution, arbitrary arrests and detention on questionable grounds of political opponents, members of civil society, human rights defenders, journalists and media workers from the beginning of the election campaign in June. Even more alarming is disproportionate repression and use of force against peaceful protesters, which led to beatings and torture of detainees, both women and men, solely for having organized or taking part in protests. We strongly condemn all violence and torture perpetrated against peaceful protesters. People should be able to exercise the right to freedom of expression and contribute to a sound democratic debate. Croatia recognizes the need for new and free elections in Belarus, organized under the supervision of independent observers. Finally, we call on the government of Belarus to find a way out of the crisis through an end to violence, de-escalation, and an inclusive national dialogue in accordance with international human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. إن مبدأ عدم التدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول الأخرى هو مبدأ يلتزم به العراق كونه مرسخا في دستوره، وفي الوقت ذاته فإن العراق يؤمن بأهمية أن تتحمل الدول مسؤوليتها الأخلاقية والقانونية في تعزيز وحماية حقوق مواطنيها وفقا لالتزاماتها الدولية. يجدد العراق تأكيده على أن مجلس حقوق الإنسان لديه العديد من الآليات التي تضمن عدم التدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول الأخرى، وفي ذات الوقت تدفع الدول إلى تعزيز واحترام حقوق الإنسان وفق مبادئ الحيادية وعدم الانتقائية وعدم التسييس، مثل آلية الاستعراض الدوري الشامل التي تعد من أكثر آليات المجلس قبولا من جميع الدول. إن المقاربة التي تدعو إلى أهمية أن تكون حماية حقوق الإنسان عابرة للحدود تبقى مقاربة غير مرغوب فيها من العديد من دول العالم، وهي موضوع خلاف واسع، حيث إن حقوق الإنسان لا تفرض على الدول من الخارج، وإنما هي ثقافة وسياسات واستراتيجيات وتكامل بين المؤسسات الحكومية وغير الحكومية من أجل بنائها بالشكل الذي يلائم المجتمع نفسه ويعزز ويحترم حقوق الإنسان لمواطنيه. ختاما، ينبغي على المجلس الحفاظ على القيم والمثل العليا لحقوق الإنسان دون إخضاعها للمتغيرات السياسية وطبيعة العلاقات الدولية، آخذين بالاعتبار المحددات المجتمعية. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Syria.
سيد الرئيس، ترفض سوريا استغلال مجلس حقوق الإنسان للضغط السياسي والتدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول وتهديد استقرارها، وتدعو إلى التوقف عن زج المجلس في الحملات السياسية الموجهة ضد الحكومات الشرعية المنتخبة. تدعم سوريا الرئيس لوكاشينكو وتثق بخيارات الشعب البيلاروسي وبحكمة قيادته وحكومته، وتشجب محاولات استغلال المجلس للتأثير على نتائج الانتخابات الرئاسية في بيلاروسيا وتقديم الدعم المباشر لأحد الأطراف السياسية فيها، باعتباره انتهاكا فظا للقانون الدولي ولدور وولاية هذا المجلس واستمرارا للمعايير المزدوجة في مواقف الاتحاد الأوروبي. الحالة في بيلاروسيا لا توفر أساسا لإجراء نقاش عاجل في المجلس، وهذا النقاش وما شابه من ثغرات إجرائية وانتقائية في عرض الأصوات من بيلاروس يساهم في التحريض على القلاقل والعنف وفي تقويض جهود الحكومة لاستعادة الاستقرار والانسجام الاجتماعي من خلال المبادرات السياسية التي أعلنت عنها. سوريا ترفض هذا المسار المسيس وتطالب بامتناع المجلس عن التدخل في الشؤون الداخلية لبيلاروس وبدعم اطلاع مؤسساتها الوطنية بمسؤولياتها إزاء الأوضاع الراهنة والتشجيع على توافق وطني ينهي المواجهة السياسية. شكرا.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Azerbaijan.
President, thank you. Azerbaijan welcomes information provided by Belarus as a concerned country. Azerbaijan enjoys friendly relations and close cooperation with Belarus in embracing political, social, economic, and humanitarian spheres. In view of the situation that emerged after the elections in Belarus, Azerbaijan believes in the importance of finding swift solutions which would lead to stability of political and social life. We are of the view that initiatives announced by the authorities of Belarus to launch constitutional reforms indicate the intention to move in this direction. We would like to emphasize that all matters falling within the domestic jurisdiction of the UN member states, including that of Belarus, must be resolved through political dialogue on the basis of the rule of law, independence, sovereignty, and constitutional order of states. We call on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to contribute to this process and support the reforms by extending its assistance and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Doy la palabra a Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta. El Ecuador considera que la relación intrínseca que existe entre la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos y el funcionamiento de un genuino sistema democrático es fundamental en el debate que nos ocupa. Mi delegación desea recalcar que la democracia auténtica está enraizada en la protección y el pleno ejercicio de todos los derechos humanos. Esto incluye, por supuesto, los derechos civiles y políticos, el derecho a la vida, el derecho a la libertad de expresión, el derecho a la libertad de reunión pacífica, el derecho al sufragio activo y pasivo, el derecho a no ser sometido a detención arbitraria y el derecho a no ser sometido a tratos y penas crueles, inhumanos o degradantes. La relatora especial de Naciones Unidas sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en Belarus, Anaïs Marin, ya recogía diversos elementos de preocupación en su informe de inicios de año. Igualmente, hace unos días, ante el Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas, la relatora se pronunció acerca de la situación de los derechos humanos en ese país a raíz de las elecciones. Los problemas de una democracia se solucionan únicamente con más democracia. El Ecuador considera que es necesario un diálogo amplio en todos los niveles y con todos los actores relevantes, incluyendo las diferentes voces de la sociedad civil, para encontrar soluciones enmarcadas en el respeto a los derechos humanos y la garantía de su pleno ejercicio por parte de la población. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. I give the floor to Malta.
Thank you, Madam President. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We thank the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur, and the other speakers for expressing their views. The deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus in the 2020 presidential election period requires the urgent attention of the Council. Malta shares the concerns raised by many delegations about reported human rights violations in the country, including the disproportionate use of force against peaceful protesters, arbitrary arrests, ill-treatment, and torture. We reiterate the calls of the High Commissioner to release those who remain in arbitrary detention, including journalists, protesters, opposition leaders, and their supporters. No one should be detained for exercising their fundamental freedoms, including the right of freedom of peaceful assembly and expression. We continue to support the OSCE's facilitating role in promoting dialogue, mutual understanding, and constructive engagement with all stakeholders. Malta stands in solidarity with the Belarusian people and civil society in their efforts to end this crisis, to end the violence, and instead establish an inclusive national dialogue in the country. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Next, we listen to the Holy See.